Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar, How to Use Benchmarks to Accelerate Your Business Goals. My name is Fanny Lofters, and I'm on the marketing team at Pendo. Before we get started, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them using our Q&A function. We will attempt to address some of the questions at the end as time allows. We will also be sharing a recording of the webinar via email with anyone who registered within the next 24 hours. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Phil Pinson is the Principal Sales Engineer at Pendo. Phil has been with us for almost a year, and before working here, Phil was an avid Pendo user in his past roles in the SaaS industry. He has a depth of expertise about the benchmarks we'll discuss today, as well as how to find these metrics in Pendo. Phil, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Fanny, and good morning / afternoon, everyone. My name is Phil Pinson, as Fanny mentioned, and really happy to and excited to walk you through our agenda today, really to looking at these various benchmarks that folks at Pendo have really been excited to build really a product cloud around. And so we'll certainly talk about these benchmarks really kind of more from a contextual perspective here. And then from there, moving on to the metrics themselves, such as feature adoption, stickiness, app retention, and finally, net promoter score, and a new metric for some of you, or at least most of you, called the product engagement score, which will be something that we'll certainly expand more on as we get through today's presentation. So to start with data in context. So if you kind of look at more objectively here, at your business goals, such as goals surrounding revenue growth, consumer growth, product diversification, product differentiation. When it comes to your various software and applications, these really turn into tactical objectiveness, such as stickiness, product adoption, customer satisfaction, etc. And so I think what's really important as we look at all of today's 5 benchmarks is to really think about how, first of all, what are your kind of goals and objectives? And then from there, how can we look at technologies and solutions such as Pendo's product cloud to help you kind of set forth a plan for success based on these business goals and measuring that success from the various benchmarks that we'll walk through today. But before we do that, I think what's really fascinating that we've seen over the past several years is Pendo and Product Collective conducted what we call the State of Product Leadership Survey over the last 3 years. And after surveying over 600 product managers, the study found that product managers no longer are focused just on revenue. So you can see in this chart here, looking at the last 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19, that whereas revenue was really the kind of the primary metric key of success, that is really transformed now into a much more level set, right, across all these other metrics. And so I think it's this in mind that we release these 5 key benchmarks to help product managers judge their performance across peers. Now that it's really become much more of a holistic picture, we look at across all these various metrics here that we'll talk about today. So we'll discuss their importance, how to find the benchmarks in Pendo, as well as best practices to help improve your performance to help reach your business goals. So with that, we're going to jump into the 5 benchmarks themselves within Pendo's product cloud. So I'm going to transition here to Pendo's product cloud. And for those of you kind of new to Pendo, think of Pendo as a very holistic way to really start to engage, insights and analytics of your various technologies, web, mobile, etc., and couple that insight and analytics with in-app guides and messaging. So with Pendo, it's really more than just having a visual understanding of product usage and adoption, for example, but then taking that a step further into the different types of actions and steps that we could take to help kind of reach those goals that we discussed earlier. Today, we'll certainly focus more on the benchmarks themselves, but just kind of keep that in mind as far as how the benchmarks fit within Pendo's product cloud. So to start here with the first benchmark on feature adoption, what I like to demonstrate is an example of Pendo's dashboards. And that's what we're looking at here. And think of our dashboards as kind of easily configurable visuals where I could come in as an end user and easily build and configure these dashboards with these square or rectangular components that we call widgets, where you can see I've kind of built one here on the fly that I like to call product adoption that kind of lays out these kind of key foundational components. And so when we think about the different components of Pendo, the first starting with visitors and accounts. So visitors would be like equivalent to your individual end users, logging into your applications. The accounts would be the respective parent entities, such as a company, division, team, organization associated with those visitors. This kind of translates to Pendo's ease of install. So in case you're curious there, less than 30 lines of JavaScript code that's embedded within the header of your web-based application. Certainly we have an SDK option for your mobile applications out there, but that's where we're able to really bring in this information quite easily. It runs asynchronously, so it doesn't impact your product's performance. So once we have that visitor and account information here, this is where we kind of transition to our first benchmark on feature adoption. So before we jump into the features themselves, just to be clear in terms of how we're defining features and how they're related to pages. So actually starting a little bit higher level with pages, right? Pages would be equivalent to your individual URLs or entire screen for mobile apps. And the primary metric that we would be measuring pages would be like page views as an example, okay? Features would be the individual CSS selectors or components within your applications where we would be measuring feature clicks. So think of it as far as how often a user or an account level is interacting with your various features within your application. Again, feature clicks being the primary metric. So with those definitions in mind, that's where we can kind of now transition to that first benchmark on feature adoption. So first, why is feature adoption really important? Well, it's an important metric for retention and expansion. The more features a user adopts, right, the more value they receive and less likely they are to churn. In fact, it's pretty interesting that looking at our own customers at Pendo, what we found was that after the first year of using Pendo to improve their products, our own clients experienced a 50% increase in just daily feature usage, right? Meanwhile, the percentage of unused features declined by nearly 25% during that time. So just in that study alone, it's fairly obvious too, but feature adoption does really matter, right? And in this example here, what we're looking at is an example of a way to measure feature adoption. So think of this as being, there's kind of a few ways to kind of measure feature adoption. The first would be like a count over time. So an example would be like your monthly active users with feature adoption rate as a percentage, and then being able to equivalent that essentially being a feature monthly active users over your monthly logins. That's one way of measuring it. The example here is kind of that second option with respect to click volume. So the percentage of features that generate 80% of clicks. So in this example here, we can see that 21% of features represent 80% of your overall feature clicks. And to look at what those specific features entail here, this is where I could come in and actually scroll and see which of these features, right, actually represent the 80% of feature clicks. Now, what's interesting from here is that if I wanted to come in and actually view any one of these features specifically, I could click on that feature itself and I could look at how that feature is trending over time. So if I wanted to see the number of visitors with that specific feature, the number of counts, the number of clicks, And if I scroll down here, I could see how that is trending over a period of time, in addition to viewing who the top visitors and the top accounts are that are engaging with that specific feature. Furthermore, with Pendo, I can add a goal for these features. So if I wanted to come in and click, and I could actually say, do I want to set an ongoing goal or some sort of time-bound goal? And from here, I could go ahead and actually draw out what my goal would look like. And I could even add this specific goal to this feature in addition to adding this to the specific dashboard that we started our conversation with. So to kind of take this all back, this is kind of all relationship to that key benchmark, right, on feature adoption, utilizing Pendo's insights on feature usage and trending over a period of time. Now, if I go back to our product adoption dashboard here, we're now going to transition, I should say, to our next metric on stickiness. So stickiness is a product engagement metric that measures how many users return on a regular basis. So why does this matter? Well, the success of product depends on retention, right? Making it essential to build products that don't just attract new users, but ensure that they continuously stay engaged. So this is where stickiness can come into play here. And there's different ways to measure stickiness. The first would be your daily active users over your monthly active users, which is what we're seeing here. So in this specific widget, what we're looking at is over the last 30 days, looking at a period of time for a segment, which in this case is everyone, across all my applications, I could easily see how my stickiness is measuring over a period of time. Now, I think it's important to stress that with stickiness, it's really about the trend over time, right, versus at one specific point. And we'll certainly expand more on this towards the end of this conversation in terms of best practices of stickiness, but just kind of keep these trend lines in mind, and we'll certainly circle back as we conclude today's webinar. But to look at another example of stickiness here, this is where I could look at maybe a specific segment of users. So still the same period of time and interval, but instead of everyone for my segment, I'm only looking at my promoters. So maybe it's really not surprisingly enough, I could see, that 97%, or above 97% of my promoters. So certainly a lot stickier with them, but perhaps I want to rerun this for my detractors, right? And you could easily do that by just simply editing any one of these widgets here within Pendo's dashboards. The second way, just to note, of how to measure stickiness would be the weekly active users relative to the monthly active users. So instead of daily active to monthly active, it would be weekly active to monthly active. So this would show the percent of monthly users who engage with your product on a weekly basis versus a daily basis. So now we'll kind of move on to our third metric, which would be on app retention. So why does app retention matter? Well, product usage is most useful when evaluated over time. So one single data point doesn't tell the whole story. So not to mention user acquisition, as we know, can be expensive, and failing to retain customers means that every new business wins results on a financial loss, right? So it's important to know how many users continue using your product, and that's where Pendo's retention application comes into play. So what we're looking at here is an example of how we can measure app retention. So think of this as being measured virtually over a time period. So in this case here, what we're looking at is really the time period over the last 6 months here on the far right. But that if we kind of step back here to look at the source here, you could look at certainly all activity, pages, features, or track events. So just to be clear, in Pendo, when we speak of track events, these would be events defined above and beyond page and feature engagement. So think of track events as a file download or a payment has been processed, right? Any sort of server-side or client-side event that perhaps you want to track. But with those different sources in mind, I could choose which applications I want to measure this at. Do I want this across all of my applications, so a multi-app environment, or do I want to filter this by a specific web application, or perhaps you have a mobile app in addition to that and you want to look at retention, broken out at the mobile level. Because I've chosen the feature as my source, I now can choose the node entry field as my specific feature option that I want to measure my retention on. My cohort type, I'll stick with visitors here, and then cohort size, I'll certainly stick with the monthly level. But just note that if I wanted to define an additional segment here, there's various rules that I have flexibility to basically segment visitors and accounts and even product usage based on metadata. So if you have a CRM system or a Salesforce or a data warehouse that is storing some of that attribute information, such as a user role, right, or geographic location, you're able to create these segments and apply segments across any of the analytics and feature usage in Pendo's product cloud. So with all of those defined here, now I can go in and actually measure my retention. So here in the chart, I could see my various cohorts here of who's been retained here on the left side, and then across the columns here are the individual months themselves. What's really great about the retention app and the value of this is that if I click on any one of these specific cells, I could actually look at who specifically retained for that given month and cohort over a period of time, in addition to who perhaps dropped. Now, what's really great about this is that I have the ability to create segments off of these visitors, whether they're the retained ones or the dropped ones. Well, why would that be important? Well, I could, using that defined segment, engage with those users, for example, with in-app messaging or tools or onboarding experiences to help either further drive that retainment or retention, I should say, for perhaps my visitors here on the left, but then, perhaps engage with my dropped visitors in a different way, maybe outside of my application if they really haven't been able to come back, to better assess, why they dropped, right? Or if they're more interval, right? Looking at some of the usage trends of these dropped visitors, right? How are they navigating my application, right? These are all questions that benchmarks such as app retention is really going to help you understand, when you start to discern retained users versus dropped users. So we'll now move to our next metric here, which would be on Net Promoter Score. So why NPS matters? Well, NPS or Net Promoter Score is one of the most popular ways for companies to gauge customers' propensity to advocate for their brand, right? So it serves as a proxy for customer happiness and eventually business growth. In fact, in a recent Pendo survey, we found that 57% of product managers are actively using NPS to understand how likely their customers are to recommend their product to others. So it's certainly a reliable proxy for loyalty. Now, many of us are probably very familiar with NPS. For those who are maybe new to it or haven't really engaged with it much, it's measured typically on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 to 6 are measured as your detractors, 7 to 8 are your passives, and then 9 to 10 are your promoters. So NPS is calculated by subtracting the percentage of those detractors, so 0 to 6, from the percentage of promoters, 9 to 10. So in this example, we're just going to show you how you can create the, and the key thing to note here is in-app. Okay, so in-app NPS surveys, where I could basically create the content for that survey. So I could mimic the, the score itself, the message, the look and design and feel of this message. I could certainly manage this in my application, and then I could control how it's activated, whether it's activated automatically, which in this case, you perhaps want to do that for a survey. And then in addition to what segment I want to apply that NPS survey to. So will this be to all of your users, or will this be more to your, based on perhaps going back to the previous metric, retained users versus not retained users, right? And then certainly have the ability to schedule these NPS surveys, have the ability to provide localization, and can certainly send this as an email in addition to the in-app experience. So going back, I think, in terms of measuring this benchmark here, that is where the NPS responses tab will really come into play here. And so I think what's really important here is that, with Pendo, not only are you able to measure the NPS scores over a period of time, but I could actually look at the distribution of those scores here based on my promoters, passive, and detractors here. Now, the important thing to note is that while perhaps you are, many of you are probably measuring NPS, maybe it's not as fancy as what you're seeing here. I think the important thing here is to really take NPS as a benchmark and couple it with product usage. So if I scroll down here, in addition to how my scores are trending here, I can certainly categorize my NPS by various accounts. Certainly any of that metadata we talked about in segmentation, such as industry, maybe account size by revenue, right? You have many ways to slice and dice this, but that product usage really comes into play down here. So in this chart here, what we're looking at is based on our detractors and our promoters, what are my individual page or feature usages based on those detractors or promoters. So in this case, I'll stick with pages. And if I hover over any of these lines here, I could actually look at which specific page is being used more by my detractors. And then conversely, on the right side, look at which pages are being used more by my promoters. We can see there's certainly a outlier here to the far right. So this is perhaps going to help you understand, or maybe further engage with why is this page so liked by so many users, right? What is it about this page that your users are finding, immense amounts of value on? Whereas on the flip side, what is it about this page that perhaps users are not liking about this, right? What are their usage patterns? What's the page engagement? These are all questions that, Pendo's product cloud will easily allow you to answer by drilling into the page itself. But to stay on track here, the final chart we talked about coupling NPS with product usage would be the usage by score. So in this case, these dots represent all of your individual visitors or users that were in the survey, and it's charting their average usage minutes per active day here on the vertical axis based on the NPS score here on the horizontal axis. And if you are able to, if you have a CRM system like a Salesforce, you could actually link that metadata such as revenue. And if I toggle this revenue on, you'll see that each of those visitors now are sized by their revenue impact on your organization. So within this chart now, I could look at, these quadrants here. If I hover over these squares on the right, that will help me understand who are my high usage detractors, my low usage detractors, and then the flip side on my high usage promoters and low usage promoters. Based on these quadrants, I could then understand how do I want to engage with these users based on their usage and their detractor and promoter. If I wanted to even drill down further and click on an individual user, I could look at their days active and time usage, and then even drill further into the view visitor details. So let's say I wanted to know, hey, I'd like to understand what is it about, looking at the NPS benchmark, what was this end user actually doing before they submitted a poor score, right? So if I click on view visitor details here, what this will launch me to is the individual visitors page, where I could look at certainly some default information about this visitor here. Now, just to really stress this, visitors in Pendo can be anonymized. So if you have sensitive, PII information, not only do we not require non-PII, but we don't, you're able to anonymize all your end users. So just want to be very clear about that. We certainly support some of the largest financial institutions, healthcare institutions. So if you're kind of in some of those verticals that has that sensitive information or GDPR, right, we very much comply with all of that. So just want to be very clear on the visitor details. But to go back to the point, if I scroll down here, I could look at the visitor usage over a period of time across multiple apps. So you can see down here, these are multiple apps, but here's where that poll was. So here was that NPS survey that they signed up. Apparently they didn't like the color blue. But if I want to now understand that product usage, I could look at the timestamp of when that visitor responded to that poll, right? August 27th. And then I could come into the timeline, and just to illustrate my point, I could go down to that time frame, right? But just to kind of show you what this would look like. Once I find the timeline that I want to be able to show that NPS survey, I could hover over these respective features and pages here to understand what that end user was doing over that period of time. So you can see here's the timetable here on the bottom axis. And then if I just hover over any of these circles or squares, this will indicate by application which pages or features your visitor was engaging with before they submitted that low NPS score. So the last main metric that I want to highlight would be on the product engagement score. So the product engagement score, I'm going to actually go back to slide format here, and you'll see why in a minute, because the product engagement score will offer you a more holistic view of product engagement. So it's actually going to be based on the metrics that we just walked through in Pendo's product cloud. So it's going to be based on the average of stickiness, feature adoption, and app retention into a single data point. So how you measure this? First, calculate your stickiness, which we walked through today, right? By looking at, which should be your frequency, which is your daily active users over your monthly active users. The next would be breadth. So feature adoption, the percentage of features that generate 80% of events is one way, right? So, and then the third would be depth, app retention. So the percentage of app retention after 3 months. So frequency, breadth, and depth are the three components. And you take the average of those three numbers to calculate the product engagement score, or PES. Now, as we start to conclude today's webinar here, I wanted to maybe, let's take a look back, because I know that was a lot of information leveraging Pendo's product cloud. And let's talk a bit more about about benchmarks, best practices. So if we look at, going back to feature adoption, right? Before setting goals, really start by looking back at your previous adoption rates. So this will help you understand, where you should set your baseline for new products. Is what you're releasing a replacement, another feature, or is this something brand new? Number two, not all users should be using every feature. So product managers may need the same tools that success, right, roles will use, which is one of the reasons why we ask our customers at Pendo what their role is, so they could help drill into what's going to be most relevant based on their role, right? So really examining feature adoption at both that user level and account level is going to be really important to really understand feature adoption, because you will see very different insights based on those respective levels. Be persistent. So with the feature adoption measurement, persistency really does pay off, right? It's features can be easily adopted, or highly adopted, I should say, when they're first released, but certainly can trend down over a period of time. So how do you retain that and ensure that you have a successful feature adoption? And that's where in-app messaging and guides, right? Something we didn't have really a time to get into today in Pendo's product cloud can be a really key component or tool to help ensure that persistency when it comes to feature adoption. The next would be on, when it comes to stickiness. So going back to stickiness, understand the nuance of your business. So two technologies I like to draw contrast to, right? Facebook versus Airbnb, right? So active usage for a social network like Facebook is going to closely monitor your daily active users perhaps, right? Whereas technologies in the hospitality business such as Airbnb would attach a different KPI to product usage. Perhaps it would be weekly active users or monthly active users or something else, right? So understand the nuance of your business is really important for stickiness. Determine what success means, right? So going back to my Airbnb example, what's the right level to trigger usage success? So logging in, searching for a rental, booking a rental. These are context sensitive decisions. So what's the desired level of engagement? Number three, more engagement isn't always better. I like to think of this as like your Expensifys of the world versus Concur, right? Where, these are tools that you're logging in to upload your receipts for reimbursement for your business. Well, sometimes more engagement is not an indicator of friction. So, if you're an organization like Expensify, do you want users logging into your applications more than needed to fix an automatic receipt categorization, as just an example of what I'm referring to, right? So, just keep that in mind, right? That more engagement doesn't always mean it's better. Stickiness is just a starting point. So the ability to increase your stickiness score and understand what changes its impact is arguably more important than the score itself. App retention. Really, I think I like this a lot because with app retention, onboarding is such a key component, right, to ensuring that quick time to value for your end users. And retention starts with successful onboarding. So, your end users must be able to execute that one or two key use case that as product managers, as success managers, that we want to ensure not only there's immediate value, but that there can be retained value, right? And continue gaining that value is going to really lead to successful app retention, but it really does start with onboarding. Number two, plan your activations. So once that onboarding is complete, right, it's critical that once your users see that immediate value in your product, helping them realize those early wins will help build momentum and help motivate them to return. And then finally, on usage habits. So what triggers should prompt those end users to come back to your applications to complete another task, right? What are those key usage habits that you want to define to ensure that you have app retention? NPS. So, the last, as we walk through with NPS, understanding the scores, the response rates, the distribution, right? Those are all areas we looked at. One thing I really would want to key on that we didn't really touch on today, but just include a section in your NPS survey for those written comments. Those verbatims can provide valuable context to the numerical score. Number two, following up with both promoters and detractors. And we saw that in the quadrants when we looked at combining the NPS scores with the survey results. So savvy companies will reach out to those promoters and ask for reviews or references. On the flip side, they'll reach out to detractors and learn while they are not delivering an ideal product experience, right? And with that specific insight on the visitors themselves, you can look at the product usage and get really specific in terms of the questions you're asking based on the users you're speaking with. And then conduct these NPS surveys over time. I think this can go without saying for some organizations, but it is important to ensure that this is not just a snapshot. It's about looking at these trends over a period of time. And then similar to some of the other metrics, measuring NPS at both the user and account level, that's important because you'll get a broad view of how willing your customers are to recommend your product, and then plot that account level NPS against product usage and account size. And with that, you can unlock actionable insights into which customers may be at the highest risk of churn. And what's more is that you could pinpoint where you don't have an NPS score, which will prompt you to reach out and find alternative ways to gauge the segments of those respective accounts. And then on the product engagement score, that's really just that calculation, right, of those previous metrics that we talked about. So, I think, just keep in mind that with the, PES, stickiness, feature adoption, app retention, or another way of putting it here at Pendo, we call it frequency, breadth, and depth, right, are really kind of key components, right, as we look back at all the best practices for these various metrics. So, in conclusion, I hope you saw value in today's webinar that helps really understand these key benchmarks here. And I think, some of the where I conclude with is on some of the key takeaways. So overall, looking at back at these benchmarks holistically, clearly define your goals for product teams, right? We talked about business objectives such as revenue growth, consumer growth, product diversification, product differentiation as being some of those, but that's where it really starts before you get into the benchmarks themselves. And then once you have those clearly defined goals for your teams, identify data metrics that drive business objectives, right? So what are those metrics going to be? And then review that performance in context with the benchmarks. Discern areas of opportunity and improvement. So, once, and we kind of talked a little bit about this today, when we evaluated some of the benchmarks to really kind of dig in deeper to understand, like, where can we improve, right? Or where are we doing a great job on, right? Just having that insight and feedback is going to be really valuable so that you can ensure that you're developing what's most applicable for your end users. And then, look, we all understand that we're not going to get it perfect every time, right? Test and iterate based on user feedback. I think, there's something I can't stress enough. We didn't have time to get into the qualitative feedback of Pendo's product cloud, but that's a big component to this, right? It's one thing to measure these benchmarks based on the quantitative information, such as user clicks, page views, right, navigation, but really understanding that feedback in NPS, qualitative surveys, right, multi-poll responses will enable your teams to test and iterate based on user feedback. Otherwise, you risk kind of being in the fog, so to speak, when it comes to product direction. So with that, kind of an action item, I'd say, for those who've made it to the end, explore these benchmarks yourselves, and you could actually download a customizable report. So here's a link to that report here on the screen. You could also find it by just going to pendo.io and navigate to our product benchmarks page on Pendo's website to learn more. And I hope you've really enjoyed today's webinar and that found it insightful and informative. And with that, we have some time for some questions, and I will leave it to Fanny to kick us off with some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Phil. Really appreciated you delivering that great content. We do have some live questions that were asked. So let's start with this one. Phil, can you talk about how you can determine the underlying cause for an underperforming benchmark metric?
Yeah, excellent question, Fanny. So underlying cause of from a performing benchmark. So, I think, we looked at some of the dashboards, right, and some of the benchmarks and what they're indicating. But then, I think the question becomes, well, like for example, if my stickiness is trending downward, why is that, right? And so what's great about, Pendo's product cloud is that you're able to further drive into like the usage behavior of those cohorts. So if you recall in that stickiness example, we looked at everyone as a cohort and then we looked at promoters, but perhaps we want to look at detractors, right? Or at least segment those out. And so based on that segmentation, I could really drill in to better understand, is this benchmark underperforming because users are dropping off at a given point, right? I was actually speaking with a prospect of Pendo, and they were evaluating, and they said, look, one thing that we realized using Pendo's tool is that we were able to see that after step 7, so this is like a very form heavy application, right? So a lot of forms for insurance agents to fill in. They saw that at step 7, there was a big drop off, and they wanted to know why was that, and it was kind of hurting their overall stickiness metric. And so what they concluded was that in step 7, a question was being asked that simply wasn't relevant to the vast majority of agents. So they thought they were in the wrong form. So that's just one tiny example of where you could use a product cloud like Pendo to like drill in based on usage to uncover why that benchmark is underperforming.
Great, thanks for that, Phil. We've also got someone asking, for retention report, if a visitor is dropped and they log in some date in the future, how will the retention report show them in the future? Will it show them as dropped, retained, or part of a different cohort?
Yeah, so excellent question. So it's based on the time frame. So you could set any sort of time frame on app retention. So say that they logged in and then logged out, and then they didn't return for several more months. So if your time frame is only looking at 6 months and they logged back in after those 6 months, certainly the report wouldn't show that. So depending, I think really just to take a step back, I think the question I would ask yourself is like, based on the type of application you have, what is kind of a successful benchmark when it comes to retention? So in other words, going back to my Airbnb versus Facebook example, like, is your application the type where users should be ideally, right, in an ideal state, logging in almost daily? Or is it? I've certainly seen other like legal examples, like for lawyers where they're logging in based on when their cases are in trial. So that retention, I mean, they're not logging in for sometimes 6 months at a time. So regardless of what the time frame is, you can use the retention application and define the time frames that are most appropriate for your application to ensure that you're not omitting users logging back in the future.
Great. We've got another one here. What types of actions can you take when you see that these metrics are underperforming?
Yeah, so it's a good holistic question. I think certainly it starts with understanding, assuming that you have like your business objectives / goals in place, which benchmarks now you're measuring. I think it first kind of starts with understanding, looking at all the benchmarks across the board, right? And we go back to that previous slide on the study that concluded that, all these metrics really do matter. There's not just one that really matters. So for example, like if you have like low feature adoption, but you have a high stickiness, your users are super happy, so your NPS is high, right? I think I wouldn't be overly concerned about that, right? But then, if you certainly see kind of a below bar across all of the benchmarks, or the vast majority, certain steps I would certainly take is really just starting from fresh, assuming you haven't already, to say, let's just understand which features are being most heavily utilized versus not, right? What are the different user journeys that users are taking? What's my funnel? Like, where's the drop-offs based on the key use cases that I've defined, right? Those are just some key actionable things you can do, leveraging like a product cloud like Pendo's to really help alleviate, or at least start to gain some progress or momentum against those benchmarks, right? And we've seen this time and time again. And if you go to Pendo's website and look at our customer stories, time and time again, that if you simplify your user experience, and like, for example, if you take what takes maybe a 20 clicks to get a use case or a journey complete, and you reduce that down to 10 clicks based on, implementing in-app tooltips, guides, notifications, in addition to perhaps redesigning certain parts of your application, simplifying pages, retention goes up, right? I mean, engagement goes up. So we've seen this time and time again. I think the question is which benchmarks do we start with? And then how do I now take a tool to really help measure my product success on those benchmarks by looking at those various areas I just described?
Thanks, Phil. Somebody asked, if you had one benchmark to focus on first, which one would it be and why? Just discuss a little bit about how you go about finding that one benchmark you'd like to focus on.
Ooh, this might be one of the hardest ones. Good question, whoever asked that. I would, I think this is just my opinion, right? I think, again, going back to that survey, it's across the board, right? There's not one like key winner, but, I think personally that the fastest, easiest way I think is, I kind of like to, I'm just a quick time to value person, would be really just on feature adoption. And if I could maybe cheat that question a little bit, but measuring that with stickiness. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, if you're able to just quickly log in to like a product cloud like Pendo and just order your features by usage, just to say, look, what are the top features that people like, right? And then couple that feature usage with your scripts or your designed intent, right? Your user journeys that your product team has laid out. I think that's just a very quick, useful way to really quickly understand, like, are the feature usage metrics I'm looking at here, is that in line with what I want my end users to engage with, right? But where I bring in the stickiness on that is just don't forget that, if these are new features, right? Or if they're legacy features, I think that's where the stickiness is going to also be really important, or at least the feature trending over time, the feature usage trending over time. Because I really do believe that, while it's important to understand which features are and are not being leveraged, let's not forget the time frames, right? And trends do matter. And so, yeah, I think that would be kind of my key one if I had to pick one, but they're all important. I love them all.
Thanks, Phil. Here's one that is a little bit more specifically about Pendo. How are you even able to get pages and features into Pendo in the first place? Can you explain that process?
Yeah, good question. I think, we kind of certainly focused the vast majority of today's product demo on the outputs. But certainly that's a really important way to kind of start the building components of tagging features and pages. And so, look, I think, there's certainly a lot of tools and applications in today's world when it comes to really identifying features and pages. But I think, up until recently, how do we do this in a very easy manner that not just, or that does not require engineering or development effort. And so with Pendo's Product Cloud, you're able to self-tag features. In fact, I had my own relative actually tag. This is somebody who's not in product, not in technology, and I was actually able to have them tag their own page or feature. So to show, just like that in itself should be proof of how easy it is to tag based on really, it's just a simple designer tool that sits on top of your live application. So you're able to look at your own app and with a really easy UI, be able to look at the pages or components of your application that you want to tag. So if you're a product manager, if you're a client success manager, heck, even sales and marketing, depending on how small or big your organization is, any of us can now tag, and we don't need to pull in engineering and development resources. So it's something I think is really important to get to that quick time to value to quickly measure these benchmarks.
Appreciate that, Phil. And we've got one final question. Should I equally focus on measuring all benchmarks? If not, how do I know which benchmarks I should be using?
Yeah, excellent question. I think, it goes back to, we saw the survey, right? And how, certainly across the board really does matter. I think that it really does start with understanding those business, I like to kind of start kind of broadly, and I'll narrow in on the answer, but, focus kind of like, what are the main business objectives for your organization, right? And then from there, kind of discern like, what are some of the like key like measurements that you want to be able to measure from there that's going to make the most sense for your business, right? So it's hard to answer that question without your business in mind, because again, certain metrics are maybe going to mean a bit more based on the type of technology you are than others. But what I would say is that the good news of that maybe a nuanced answer is that you now have like a product cloud like Pendo or other solutions out there where you could actually look at all these metrics literally within a matter of weeks, from start to finish, as far as getting the solution installed, configuring it, and then being able to start to at least get some early indicators, right? Certainly you want to measure this more over just a period of some weeks, but to at least start getting some data across all these benchmarks. And we did that today in an hour, right? As far as just evaluating all 5 of these in less than 60 minutes, right? Now, obviously it took a lot of work to get to this point. I fully recognize that, but I just want to be clear that for the first time now, you can easily measure all these benchmarks without having to go through a very tedious manual process of doing that. So I would really just take a step back and just start with the business objectives, look at, now looking at these benchmarks, which ones make the most sense. And heck, I would also give it the benchmarks guide a try on our website, because that customizable report will certainly give you some leading indicators as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Phil. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Phil, we really appreciated you speaking on our benchmarks tool and the importance of metrics and product. If you haven't already, like Phil said, head on to our benchmarks page on our website. You can download a report that is actually customizable for your use and within your company size as well. We will be sending a recording of this webinar to everyone who's registered, and we'll also just go ahead and include a link to that benchmarks page for you in the follow-up. We hope you enjoyed today's findings shared by Phil, and thank you all and have a great day.